Adisa felt like the luckiest woman in the world. Sitting beside Chikondi in the grand wedding hall, she smiled, believing this was the start of a beautiful forever. Her ivory gown shimmered under the lights as she gazed at the man she loved. They had promised to stand by each other, no matter what. But as she walked into her new home that night, her heart filled with excitement. She had no idea her dream was about to shatter. Adisa stepped into Chikondi's family mansion, expecting warm smiles and welcoming hugs. But instead of love, she was met with cold, serious faces. Mama Chikondi stood in the center of the grand living room, holding a thick envelope. Her sharp eyes studied Adisa, and without a smile, she extended the envelope toward her. "Before you enter this house as our son's wife, you must sign this contract," she said firmly. Adisa blinked, confused. "Contract?" she repeated, hesitating before taking the envelope. She opened it, her hands shaking slightly. As her eyes scanned the pages, her heart pounded harder. Rules, restrictions, commands. She had to quit her job immediately. She could not visit her parents without permission. She would have no claim to any family wealth, no matter what happened in the marriage. And the worst part, if she disobeyed even one rule, Chikondi could divorce her instantly. Her fingers tightened around the papers. She looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is this a joke?" "No joke," Baba Chikondi said in a deep, firm voice. "Sign it, or leave our son." Adisa's breath caught in her throat. Leave? They were asking her to choose between her freedom and her marriage, on the very night she had become their son's wife. Her gaze shifted to Chikondi, the man who had promised to love and protect her, the man she had trusted with her heart. He stood there silent. He didn't protest. He didn't defend her. He didn't even look surprised. Tears burned in Adisa's eyes. "Chikondi," she whispered, hoping, praying that he would say something, anything to stop this madness. But he only sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's just a formality, Adisa. Just sign it, and everything will be fine." Her stomach twisted. Formality. How could he say that? She looked at the contract, the inked words staring back at her like a trap. If she signed, she would be a prisoner in this house, a woman with no voice, no rights, no freedom. Was this the marriage she had dreamed of? Adisa's hands trembled, the weight of her choice pressing down on her like a heavy stone. Sign it, or walk away. Her heart screamed for an answer. Adisa's hands shook as she held the contract. Her eyes darted between the papers and Chikondi, the man she had just married, the man who had promised to love her, cherish her, and protect her. She wanted to believe he would stand up for her, that he would tell his parents this was wrong, that he would take the contract, tear it apart and say, "Adisa is my wife. She doesn't need to sign anything to prove it." But he didn't. Instead, Chikondi let out a tired sigh. "It's just a formality, Adisa. Just sign it, and everything will be fine. Just sign it." Her heart dropped. How could he say that? How could he be so calm when his parents were trying to control her life? Did he not see how unfair this was? Adisa felt the heat of tears building in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't cry in front of them, not in front of Mama Chikondi, who was watching her like a hawk, not in front of Baba Chikondi, whose face was cold and stern, and not in front of Chikondi, the man who was supposed to be on her side. She gripped the pen they had placed in front of her, her fingers curled tightly around it, her knuckles turning white. Did they think she was so desperate to be a wife that she would sign away her freedom? Did they think she had no choice? Adisa took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She looked at Chikondi one more time, hoping, praying he would change his mind, that he would see the pain in her eyes and stop this madness. But he just stood there, silent, and in that moment, she knew he would never fight for her. She was alone. Adisa's heart pounded like a drum. The heavy silence in the room was suffocating. All eyes were on her. The contract sat in front of her, demanding her obedience. Mama Chikondi's sharp gaze burned into her. Baba Chikondi's arms were crossed, his face stone cold. And Chikondi, her husband, the man who should have been her partner, stood there, saying nothing. She felt the weight of the pen in her hand. Her fingers trembled, but not from fear. No, she was done being afraid. Slowly, she took a deep breath. Then, without hesitation, she lifted the contract. and tore it into pieces. Gasps filled the room. Mama Chikondi let out a sharp scream, clutching her chest like she had been struck. The shredded paper fluttered to the floor like falling leaves. Baba Chikondi's face turned red with anger. His hands clenched into fists. Chikondi's eyes widened in shock. "Adisa, what are you doing?" he shouted, grabbing her wrist. She yanked her hand away and met his gaze, her voice steady, her heart clear. "I married you for love, not for ownership," she said, her words sliced through the air, sharp and unshakable. "If this is what marriage to you means, then I choose my freedom." The room fell into stunned silence. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Then, without another word, Adisa turned around and walked away. She stepped out of that house, out of that trap, out of a future that was never meant for her. The cold night air hit her skin, but she had never felt so free. Adisa stepped out of the grand mansion, her wedding dress trailing behind her. The cold night air wrapped around her, but it was nothing compared to the chill in her heart. This wasn't how her wedding night was supposed to be. She was supposed to be in her husband's arms, dreaming about their future. Instead, she was walking away, alone, but not broken. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't cry for people who saw her as nothing more than an object to control. She wouldn't beg for love that came with chains. She had no husband now, no home of her own, no clear future, but she had something more powerful, the courage to say no. She walked for what felt like hours, her bare feet aching from the sharp stones on the road. When she finally reached her parents' house, her mother opened the door, eyes wide with shock. "Adisa!" Without a word, Adisa stepped inside. She was home. But she wasn't the same woman who had left in a bridal gown. The days that followed were filled with whispers. People talked. They judged. They gossiped. She left her husband on her wedding night. How can a woman be so bold? She will regret it. No man will marry her now. Adisa heard every word, but she didn't care. Instead of hiding, she got up early every morning and worked harder than ever. She poured all her pain, anger, and determination into her career. She wasn't just a lawyer, she became a force. Courtrooms that once intimidated her became her battlefield. She fought for women like her, women who had been told they had no choice. She read every case, stayed up late preparing arguments, and stood tall in front of judges who once overlooked her. And slowly, something incredible happened. The name Adisa Mwal became known. People started to respect her. Clients sought her out, impressed by her boldness. Her story spread, turning into something greater than just gossip. It became a symbol of a woman who chose herself months past. And Adisa changed. She no longer thought about the wedding that never truly was. She no longer wondered what would have happened if she had signed that contract, because now she knew what she had gained: freedom, power, purpose. One evening, as she sat in her office, flipping through case files, her assistant knocked on the door. "Mum, there's someone here to see you." Adisa looked up. "Who?" Her assistant hesitated. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, "It's Chikondi." Adisa smiled, but it wasn't a smile of longing. It wasn't a smile of regret. It was a smile of a woman who had won. Chikondi's family thought they had won. Adisa was gone. She had refused to obey, and they believed they could replace her like she was nothing. So, they found another bride, one who was willing to sign their precious contract. At first, everything seemed perfect. The new wife smiled, obeyed, and followed all their rules. Mama Chikondi bragged to everyone, "This is the kind of wife a man needs, not that stubborn Adisa." But soon, cracks started to show. The new wife was not as obedient as they thought. She controlled Chikondi's money, spent without limits, and demanded luxuries. She brought endless drama into their home, fighting, manipulation, chaos. She didn't leave her job. She didn't ask for permission before visiting her family. And worst of all, she made sure that if anyone was in control, it was her. Mama and Baba Chikondi tried to stop her, but this time their own rules worked against them. They had forced their son to marry a woman who didn't love him, only his wealth, and she was draining it fast. Chikondi's miserable life. Chikondi sat in his grand house, but it didn't feel like home anymore. His wife barely spoke to him unless she needed something. His parents were stressed, unable to control the situation. Arguments filled the air instead of laughter. Everything felt empty. One night, he sat alone in the dark, staring at his hands. For the first time in months, he thought about Adisa, her smile, her warmth, the way she looked at him on their wedding day, full of love and trust. And then, he remembered the pain in her eyes when he betrayed her. He had let his family destroy the best thing that ever happened to him. Now he was trapped in a miserable marriage. And Adisa? She had walked away from him, and she was thriving. Adisa was in her office, reviewing case files when the door opened. She barely glanced up. "Who is it?" The receptionist hesitated. "There's someone here to see you." Before she could ask who, a familiar voice filled the room. Adisa. Her hand froze around her pen. She knew that voice. Knew it too well. Slowly she looked up. Chikondi stood in the doorway, but he wasn't the same confident man she once knew. His shoulders sagged, his face looked tired, and his once bright eyes held nothing but regret. He took a shaky step forward. "I made a mistake." Adisa leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "Oh? Which one?" His jaw clenched. "I let you go." She studied him carefully. This was the man who had stood silent when his family tried to control her. The man who had let her walk away as if she was replaceable. And now, here he was, broken. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Chikondi sighed. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought if I kept my family happy, everything would work out." His voice cracked. "But I was wrong. So wrong." Adisa tapped her fingers against her desk. "And now you see it?" He nodded. "My parents, they chose another wife for me. She signed the contract." She raised an eyebrow. "So, what's the problem? You got what you wanted." A bitter chuckle escaped his lips. "She wasn't you, Adisa." He ran a hand down his face. "She drained me, took everything. My parents are miserable. Our home is a battlefield. And me, I lost the only woman who ever truly loved me." Adisa exhaled slowly, looking at the man who once held her heart. She had cried for weeks after walking away, had questioned herself 1,000 times. But now, as she sat in her office, successful, powerful, and free, she realized she had made the best decision of her life. She stood up, walking around her desk until she was right in front of him. "Do you know what hurt me the most, Chikondi?" He swallowed hard. "What? You didn't fight for me." His head dropped. "I would have gone through fire for you," she continued. "But when your family tried to control me, you stood there and let it happen." "I was scared," he whispered. "I thought they knew best." Adisa shook her head. "Number, you just didn't think I was worth the fight." A heavy silence filled the room. Chikondi reached for her hand, desperation in his eyes. "But I know now. I know I made the biggest mistake of my life. Please, Adisa, let's start over." She looked at his hand, then back at him. Once upon a time, she would have given anything to hear these words, but not anymore. Adisa smiled softly, stepping back. "I already started over, Chikondi, without you." And with that, she walked past him, leaving him exactly where he left her, alone. Chikondi dropped to his knees right there in her office, his voice shaking. "Adisa, please, give me another chance." Adisa arched an eyebrow, folding her arms. "Another chance?" He nodded desperately. "Yes, let's start over. I'll do anything." She tilted her head. "And what about the contract?" His face darkened with shame. "I was a fool. I should have fought for you." She let out a slow breath, shaking her head. "Yes, you should have." Chikondi reached for her hand, his grip trembling. "Adisa, I know I hurt you. I know I failed you. But I swear, I've changed. I see everything clearly now." His voice cracked. "I love you." She stared at him for a long moment, searching his eyes. Once upon a time, she had dreamed of hearing those words. She had imagined a future where he realized his mistake and came back, begging for her. But now, she didn't feel the rush of hope she once would have. She only felt free. Adisa gently pulled her hand away. "You only love me now, because you lost me." "No," he insisted. "I loved you all along. I was just blind." She sighed. "Love isn't blind, Chikondi. Love is brave. Love stands up, speaks out, fights for what's right. And you were silent when it mattered most." He clenched his jaw, his hand still reaching for her. "Please, Adisa, I'll spend my whole life making it up to you." She gave him a sad smile. "You know, once upon a time, I would have said yes without thinking. I would have run back to you, hoping things would be different." Chikondi's eyes lit up with hope. Then let's, but I'm not that woman anymore. His breath hitched. Adisa stood tall, looking down at the man who had once let her go. She had spent too long waiting for someone to choose her, to fight for her, to love her the way she deserved. But she didn't need that anymore, because now she chose herself. She took a step past him, pausing only to whisper, "I fight for myself now." And just like that, she walked away, leaving him on his knees, just as she had once been. Adisa didn't look back. She didn't need to. Her victory wasn't loud. It wasn't about revenge. It was in every step she took away from the man who once thought she would always wait for him. She walked out of that office with her head high, her heart light, not because she had hurt Chikondi, but because for the first time, she had chosen herself. And that choice? It changed everything. Adisa built a life without chains, without restrictions, without anyone telling her who she could be. She thrived. She grew. Her name became one people respected, a fierce, brilliant lawyer who fought for women who had once stood where she had, women who had been told to shrink, to obey, to accept less than they deserved. She became their voice. And Chikondi, he watched from a distance. He saw her face on magazine covers, heard her name in boardrooms, watched as she smiled in interviews, her eyes shining with a happiness that had nothing to do with him. He had once believed she needed him, that she would always be waiting. But now he knew the truth. She was never meant to be his. She was meant to be free, and that was his greatest regret. Years later, Adisa stood on a grand stage, facing a room full of powerful people. The lights were bright, the cameras rolling. She was no longer just a woman who walked away. She was a name, a force, an inspiration. The host smiled at her. "Adisa, your story has touched millions. But tell us, what was the moment that changed everything for you?" Adisa took a deep breath, her mind flashing back to that night, the heavy contract in her hands, the cold stares of her in-laws, Chikondi's silence, the feeling of her heart breaking. And then, the moment she tore the contract apart and chose herself. She smiled. "The night I refused to sign away my worth." The room fell silent for a second. Then, applause. Loud, thunderous. People stood, clapping, nodding, some even wiping their eyes. Because it wasn't just her story. It was the story of so many women who had been told to accept less, to obey, to give up their dreams for a marriage that only benefited the man. But Adisa had done what so many feared to do. She had walked away, and she had won. Not just with money, not just with fame, but with something far greater, freedom. She had built a life where no one could control her, a life where her voice mattered, a life where she was truly happy. And Chikondi, his name had faded, his family's power had crumbled. No one remembered the people who tried to silence greatness. But Adisa, she had become a symbol, a legend, a woman who proved that walking away isn't losing. Sometimes it's the greatest victory of all. Years passed, but Adisa's name never faded. It grew. It echoed in courtrooms, in universities, in boardrooms filled with powerful women who whispered her story to themselves before making bold decisions. She wasn't just a woman who walked away. She was a movement. Her story spread through Zambia like wildfire, then across Africa, then beyond. Women who had been told to stay silent found their voices. Women who had been made to believe they were powerless stood up. Because Adisa had proven something powerful. Walking away wasn't weakness. It was power. Her face graced magazine covers. Her speeches were watched by millions. Her book, The Woman Who Chose Herself, became a bestseller. And when little girls in schools were asked who they wanted to be when they grew up, many of them had the same answer. "I want to be like Adisa." But what about Chikondi's family? They faded. Their wealth crumbled. The empire they tried to protect by controlling their son's wife slowly collapsed. Their name, once respected, became just another forgotten story of people who lost everything because they valued power more than love. And Chikondi, he watched it all from the sideline, knowing he had once held something priceless in his hands. A love that was real, a woman who would have built a life with him, but he let her go. Now, he was just another man with regret in his heart, sitting in front of a screen, watching her change the world. One evening, years later, Adisa stood on the biggest stage of her life. Thousands of people filled the stadium, waiting to hear her speak. Journalists, politicians, young girls, and women who had found strength in her story. She stepped forward, looked at the sea of faces, and smiled. "Years ago, I was given a contract," she said. "A contract that would have taken away my freedom, my dreams, and my voice." The crowd was silent, hanging on to her every word. "I was told that if I didn't sign it, I would lose everything." She let the words sink in, then smiled wider. "But look at me now." The audience erupted. Cheers, applause, standing ovations. Because in the end, Adisa didn't just escape a bad marriage. She became a name that would never be forgotten. She became a legacy. One afternoon, as Adisa walked through the city, lost in thought, a young woman hurried up to her. Her eyes were bright, filled with admiration. "Excuse me," the woman said, breathless. "You don't know me, but because of you, I chose myself too." Adisa paused, studying her. She saw the strength in her posture, the confidence in her voice, and she smiled. This was the real victory. Not revenge, not regret, not proving anyone wrong, but proving to women everywhere that they didn't have to beg for love. They didn't have to shrink themselves to fit into someone else's world. They could walk away. They could build their own lives. They could shine without permission. Adisa reached out, gently squeezing the woman's hand. "I'm proud of you." Tears welled in the woman's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. As she walked away, Adisa looked up at the sky, breathing in the moment. She had once walked away from what everyone said was the perfect life. They had called her foolish. They had laughed, whispered that she would regret it. But here she was, stronger, happier, free. And the best part, her story wasn't just hers anymore. It was a light, guiding others toward their own freedom.